The eviction notice taped to the front door of Rodriguez Family Bakery fluttered in the cold December wind like a white flag of surrender. Elena Rodriguez stood on the sidewalk outside her small shop, staring at the official document that gave her exactly 7 days to pay 3 months of back rent or lose everything she had worked for during the past 8 years. At 53 years old, Elena had the weathered hands of someone who had been kneading dough since childhood and the tired eyes of an immigrant who had sacrificed everything to build a life in America. Her bakery, located on the corner of Corktown and Michigan Avenue in Detroit's struggling southwest side, had been more than just a business. It had been her family's lifeline, her community's gathering place, and her proof that the American dream was still possible for someone who had crossed the border with nothing but determination and her grandmother's recipes. But on this gray December morning in 2021, as Elena read the eviction notice a third time, the American dream felt more like a cruel illusion. The COVID-19 pandemic had devastated small businesses throughout Detroit, but had been particularly brutal to neighborhood establishments like Elena's Bakery that depended on foot traffic, regular customers, and the kind of community connections that social distancing had made impossible. Elena's troubles had begun in March 2020, when the first lockdown orders forced her to close the bakery for 6 weeks. Even after reopening with limited capacity, sales had never recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The neighborhood's unemployment rate had skyrocketed, leaving many of her regular customers unable to afford even the modest prices she charged for fresh bread, pastries, and the traditional Mexican baked goods that had made her bakery a beloved institution in a predominantly Latino community. She had applied for every available government assistance program, the Paycheck Protection Program, emergency small business loans, state and local relief funds. But like many immigrant-owned businesses, she had struggled with the complex application processes, language barriers, and documentation requirements that seemed designed to exclude people like her. The small amount of aid she had received had been consumed quickly by rent, utilities, and the basic ingredients needed to keep the bakery operating. For months, Elena had been robbing Peter to pay Paul, using money intended for ingredients to cover rent, then using rent money to buy flour and sugar, creating a downward spiral of debt that had finally caught up with her. Her suppliers had put her on cash-only terms after she fell behind on payments. Her landlord, initially sympathetic during the early months of the pandemic, had lost patience as his own financial pressures mounted. Now, 3 days before Christmas, Elena faced a mathematical reality that had been stalking her for weeks. She had exactly $2,247 in her business checking account, enough to either pay a portion of her back rent and buy herself another month of operation, or to close the bakery forever and use the money to help her family survive until she could find another way to make a living. But as Elena stood outside her shop that morning, she wasn't thinking about her own financial crisis. Instead, she was watching the neighborhood around her and recognizing that her personal struggles were just one small part of a much larger catastrophe affecting everyone she cared about. Mrs. Patterson from 2 blocks down walked past, carrying a single bag of groceries that would have to feed her and her 3 grandchildren for the rest of the week. Miguel Santos, who used to buy coffee and pastries every morning before heading to his construction job, hadn't been employed since September, when the building project he was working on ran out of funding. The Johnsons, a young family with twin toddlers, had been evicted from their apartment the week before and were staying with relatives in a space far too small for all of them. Elena's neighborhood had always been poor, but had also been rich in community spirit, mutual support, and the kind of resilience that comes from people who have learned to survive on very little. However, the pandemic and its economic aftermath had pushed that resilience to its breaking point. Families who had once been able to help their neighbors were now struggling to help themselves. The idea that would change everything came to Elena as she unlocked the door to her bakery and stepped inside the familiar space that had been her second home for 8 years. The display cases were nearly empty. She hadn't been able to afford to bake much inventory for the past 2 weeks, but the ovens were still functional, the mixers still worked, and she still had access to wholesale suppliers if she could pay cash. What if, instead of using her last $2,247 to try to save a business that was probably doomed anyway, she used it to do something that really mattered? What if she spent that money on ingredients and prepared Christmas dinner for every struggling family in the neighborhood? The thought seemed insane even as it formed in her mind. Elena was facing financial ruin, and her rational response should have been to conserve every dollar for her own survival. But the more she considered the idea, the more it felt not just possible, but necessary. If this story truly touches your heart, let it speak for you. Like this video, subscribe to be part of our journey, and share your feelings in the comments. Elena had been raised by a grandmother who had lived through the Mexican Revolution, the Great Depression, and decades of poverty that had taught her that survival wasn't just about having enough for yourself. It was about making sure your community had enough to survive together. Mija, her grandmother, had often said, "When you have one tortilla and your neighbor has none, you split the tortilla. When you have none and your neighbor has one, you trust that they will do the same." The principle seemed simple in theory, but applying it when you're facing bankruptcy required a kind of faith that Elena wasn't sure she possessed. Still, as she walked through her empty bakery, calculating how much food she could prepare with $2,247, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about a future that extended beyond her own problems. Elena spent that afternoon walking through her neighborhood, making a mental inventory of the families she knew were struggling. The list grew longer with every block. Single mothers working multiple part-time jobs that still didn't cover basic expenses, elderly residents living on Social Security checks that forced them to choose between medications and food, immigrant families afraid to apply for government assistance because of their documentation status, and unemployed workers whose benefits had run out months ago. By evening, Elena had identified nearly 200 families who would benefit from a free Christmas meal, but she had also recognized the enormous logistical challenge of preparing food for that many people with her limited resources and equipment. Her bakery ovens could handle the baking, but she would need additional preparation space, serving containers, and volunteers to make the project feasible. Elena's first call was to Father Miguel Sanchez, the priest at St. Augustine Catholic Church, which served as both a spiritual center and community hub for the neighborhood's Latino families. Elena had known Father Miguel for years. He regularly purchased communion bread from her bakery and had officiated at her daughter's quinceañera, but she had never approached him with anything like the proposal she was about to make. "Father, I need to ask you something that might sound crazy," Elena began when she reached him by phone that evening. "I want to prepare Christmas dinner for 200 families, and I need to use the church kitchen and fellowship hall to make it happen." Father Miguel listened as Elena explained her situation. The failing bakery, the eviction notice, and her decision to spend her last resources on a community Christmas feast instead of trying to save her business. His response surprised her with its immediate enthusiasm. "Elena, I've been praying for weeks about how to help our families have a meaningful Christmas despite their struggles," he said. "I think God may have just answered that prayer through you. When do we start?" The church's industrial kitchen and large fellowship hall provided the space Elena needed, but the project still required ingredients, containers, and volunteers on a scale that seemed overwhelming. Elena began making phone calls to everyone she could think of who might be willing to help. Other small business owners in the area, regular customers from a bakery, members of the church, and community organizations that serve the neighborhood. The response was mixed. Some people were sympathetic but couldn't commit to helping with a project that seemed impossibly ambitious given Elena's limited resources and the short time frame before Christmas. Others questioned whether Elena should be giving away money she needed for her own survival. A few were bluntly critical, suggesting that her proposed generosity was actually irresponsible and that she should focus on saving her business instead of playing Santa Claus to the neighborhood. But for every person who declined to help, another stepped forward with an offer of support. Maria Gonzalez, who owned a small grocery store 3 blocks from Elena's bakery, offered to provide vegetables and other ingredients at cost. Tom Bradley, a retired auto worker who had been a regular customer at the bakery for years, volunteered to coordinate the logistics of food distribution. Carmen Rodriguez, Elena's own daughter who worked as a nurse at a local clinic, took vacation days to help with cooking and preparation. As word of Elena's Christmas project spread through the neighborhood, it began to take on a life of its own. Families who had been identified as recipients of free meals began volunteering to help with preparation and distribution. Teenagers offered to deliver meals to elderly residents who couldn't make it to the church. Even some of the neighborhood's English-speaking residents, who had never set foot in Elena's bakery, began contributing money and volunteer hours to the project. Elena spent December 22nd and 23rd in a marathon cooking session that began at 4 a.m. and ended after midnight each day. Working alongside a rotating crew of volunteers, she prepared traditional Christmas dishes that reflected the neighborhood's diverse heritage. Tamales and pozole from her Mexican traditions, soul food favorites like mac and cheese and cornbread that connected with the area's African-American families, and Polish pierogi and Italian pasta dishes that honored other immigrant communities in the area. The menu had been designed not just to provide nutrition, but to offer comfort and celebration to families who had very little to celebrate. Elena used every skill she had learned during her decades of cooking to create meals that would taste like love, not charity. Each family would receive enough food for a complete Christmas dinner: main dishes, sides, desserts, and fresh bread baked in Elena's own ovens. But the most remarkable aspect of the project wasn't the quantity of food being prepared. It was a transformation that was occurring in the volunteers and recipients as they worked together toward a common goal. The church kitchen became a hub of activity that brought together people who had been isolated by unemployment, language barriers, and the social distancing that had characterized the pandemic years. Mrs. Patterson, the grandmother Elena had noticed struggling with groceries, became one of the most dedicated volunteers, spending 12 hours each day helping with food preparation despite her own physical limitations. Miguel Santos, the unemployed construction worker, used his organizational skills to coordinate delivery routes and transportation for families who couldn't pick up their meals. The Johnson family, still dealing with their own housing crisis, somehow found time to help package meals for other struggling families. Elena watched these interactions with growing amazement. She had started the Christmas Project as a way to help her neighbors, but it was becoming clear that the project was creating something much more valuable than free meals. It was rebuilding the sense of community that had been eroded by months of economic hardship and social isolation. On Christmas Eve morning, Elena and her army of volunteers completed their final preparations for the meal distribution that would begin at noon. 200 complete Christmas dinners were packaged and ready for pickup or delivery, representing nearly 800 individual meals that would feed families throughout the holiday weekend. But Elena had also discovered something that would change her perspective on her own financial crisis. While focusing on the Christmas Project, she had stopped obsessing about her business problems and started thinking creatively about solutions. The enthusiasm and support she had seen from the community made her realize that her bakery had been more than just a business. It had been a vital part of the neighborhood's infrastructure, a place where people gathered, supported each other, and maintained cultural connections. As families began arriving at the church to pick up their Christmas meals, Elena saw her community with new eyes. These weren't just desperate people accepting charity. They were neighbors, friends, and extended family members who had been temporarily overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. The gratitude they expressed wasn't just for the food, but for being seen, valued, and included in something bigger than their individual struggles. The distribution event itself became a celebration that extended far beyond the simple exchange of meals. Families stayed to visit with each other. Children played together in the fellowship hall, and adults shared stories, job leads, and mutual support. Elena realized that she had accidentally created the kind of community gathering that used to happen naturally, but had been lost during the isolation of the pandemic. But the most powerful moment of the day came when Elena was approached by David Kim, a local businessman who owned several commercial properties in the area, including the building that housed Elena's bakery. Elena had never met Kim personally. She had always dealt with his property management company, but he had heard about her Christmas project and wanted to speak with her directly. "I understand you're facing eviction from my building," Kim said, his tone serious but not hostile. "I also understand that you spent your last money on Christmas dinners for 200 families instead of trying to save your business." Elena braced herself for criticism or legal threats, but Kim's next word surprised her completely. "I've been watching what you've accomplished here today," he continued, "and I realize that your bakery isn't just a tenant in my building. It's an anchor for this entire community. I'd like to discuss how we can work together to make sure it stays open." The conversation that followed led to a restructured lease agreement that reduced Elena's monthly rent in exchange for her commitment to continue serving as a community gathering place and host regular events that brought neighbors together. Kim, who had grown up in poverty himself before building his real estate business, understood the value of businesses that strengthen communities rather than just extracting profit from them. But Kim's support was just the beginning of the changes that flowed from Elena's Christmas project. The story of the bankrupt baker who had given away her last money to feed her neighbors spread throughout Detroit and eventually gained national media attention. The coverage brought donations from across the country, volunteer support from professional organizations, and business partnerships that helped Elena rebuild her bakery on a stronger foundation. If you made it all the way here, it means this story truly held you. So don't leave without showing some love. Hit like, subscribe to stay with us, and drop a comment. I'll be here, reading every word you share. More importantly, the Christmas Project had demonstrated the power of community-led solutions to economic hardship. Several of the families who had received free meals became regular customers at the reopened bakery. Others offered their own skills and services to help Elena reduce her operating costs. Electricians who donated repair work, accountants who helped organize her finances, and marketing professionals who helped her develop new revenue streams. The success of the Christmas Meal Project also inspired Elena to expand her community-focused approach to business. She began offering cooking classes that taught traditional recipes and food preparation skills, created a program that employed neighborhood teenagers as part-time workers, and established a small catering business that served community organizations and local events. Within 6 months of nearly losing everything, Elena had built a more sustainable and community-integrated business than she had ever imagined possible. The bakery was profitable, she had paid off her debts, and she had created a model that other small businesses in the area began to emulate. But Elena's most significant discovery wasn't financial, it was personal. The experience of giving away everything when she had nothing to spare had taught her that scarcity was often an illusion created by focusing too narrowly on individual problems instead of community solutions. When she had tried to save her business by hoarding her limited resources, she had been failing. When she gave those same resources away in service of her community, she had discovered abundance she hadn't known existed. 1 year after the Christmas Project, Elena was invited to speak at a national conference about community-based economic development. Her story had inspired similar projects in dozens of cities, and researchers were studying her approach as a model for how small businesses could strengthen communities while achieving financial sustainability. When I made the decision to spend my last $2,247 on Christmas dinners instead of rent money, I thought I was giving up on my business to help my neighbors, Elena told the conference audience. What I discovered was that helping my neighbors was the only way to save my business. But more importantly, I learned that when we take care of each other, we all survive and thrive together. The bankrupt bakery owner who had saved Christmas for 200 families had discovered that the miracle wasn't in the multiplication of resources. It was in the transformation perspective. By choosing generosity over scarcity, community over individual survival, and faith over fear, Elena had created the conditions for solutions that hadn't been visible when she was focused solely on her own problems. Elena's story became a testament to the power of seemingly impossible acts of giving, proving that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that communities have resources and resilience that become visible only when people are willing to invest in each other's well-being. 2 years after nearly losing everything, Elena Rodriguez was featured on the cover of a national business magazine as an example of innovative community-centered entrepreneurship. Her bakery had become a model for sustainable small business practices, and her Christmas project had evolved into an annual tradition that now served over 500 families and involved dozens of local businesses and organizations. But Elena still remembered that moment of standing outside her shop with the eviction notice, facing a choice between self-preservation and community service. The decision to choose generosity had seemed impossible at the time, but it had led to discoveries about abundance, community, and the power of shared resources that had transformed not just her business, but her understanding of what it meant to be successful. The woman who had nearly lost everything because she couldn't afford to pay her bills had learned that the most valuable currency wasn't money. It was the trust, support, and mutual care that exists when communities choose to invest in each other's survival and success. Elena's Christmas miracle had proven that sometimes the best business strategy is to stop thinking like a business owner and start acting like a neighbor, and that the most sustainable enterprises are those that strengthen the communities they serve rather than simply extracting profit from them. On every Christmas Eve since 2021, Elena closed her bakery early and spent the evening delivering free meals to families in her neighborhood, continuing the tradition that had saved both her business and her understanding of what really mattered. The eviction notice that had once represented her greatest fear had been framed and hung on the wall of her bakery, not as a reminder of failure, but as a symbol of the moment when everything changed because she chose to believe that giving everything away was the only way to have enough.